I don't know about all of you, but I think for the most part, probably all of us enjoy being served. What I mean by that is that we like to go to restaurants or different locations and have somebody who's there to kind of wait on us hand and foot. We like having a waiter or waitress who's there. Once our glass begins to get a little bit empty, they fill it right back up. They bring the food out to us, and what I think is the coolest part of all of it, they take the dirty dishes away for somebody else to clean them. Recently, Mandy and I, our dishwasher went on the fritz, so for the last several days we've had to wash our dishes by hand, and I've been reminded just how much I hate that chore above every other chore there is. So we're hopefully getting that fixed this week. But it's one of the favorite parts of the whole thing is having somebody who's there to wait on us hand and foot and to take care of our needs and to make sure that we have everything that we could ever desire to be part of it. There's one instance, though, where I have always found this experience to be a little uncomfortable. And maybe you have too, I don't know. But for me, I always find it uncomfortable when the waiter or waitress or person who's serving me is somebody I know. There's something about when a stranger is the one who's serving you that you have that comfort level. You don't feel it's awkward. But when it's a friend of yours or maybe the kid of a friend of yours, it's a little awkward, isn't it? Kind of creates a little anxiety in the moment. It happened a little more regularly for me when I was in high school and some in college. Just, the hostess takes you to your table and you and your party, you sit down and they say the waiter or waitress or whoever is going to be with you shortly. And then they make their way to your table and you look up and it's, oh, I know that person. Uh-oh. I mean, there's been some more awkward situations in college. I had a friend of mine who went on a date with a girl, and his waitress happened to be his ex-girlfriend he had just broken up with a couple weeks beforehand. Like, it's awkward enough when you know the person, when you know that person, and in that scenario, uh-oh. I think he left a really great tip that week, that particular time. But that's another situation that comes up. Like, how do you justify the tip at the end of the service? It feels awkward enough when they bring you your food. It's even worse when they take the dirty dishes away. But how do you do the tip in that scenario? If you don't give them enough of a tip, well, then they could get mad or upset at you, and then the friendship is over. Or if you give them too much of a tip, then they think, well, he thought that I need this more than he does, and then all of a sudden the friendship is over. It's a weird balancing act you have to take in that particular moment. It's awkward to be served by someone you know. But what if it was more than that? What if the person who was serving you was more than just your friend? What if it was a teacher or a mentor or someone you just admire, somebody that you look up to, and all of a sudden they're the one whose responsibility it is to serve you? And what if that service happens to be one of the most degrading, worst jobs that you could ever possibly think of? How do you think you'd respond if the person who's serving you is not just your friend, but is somebody you look up to, and they are voluntarily doing a job that you wouldn't want to do yourself? That's ultimately where Peter found himself in our text today. And if you've got your Bible, eventually we're going to be landing on John chapter 13, verses 2 through 15. So go ahead and open up your Bibles or open up your app to that particular text. Just kind of keep your thumb there or, lock your screen, I guess. I don't know. And we're going to get there eventually, but we got to play a little catch up here. Before we get to that text, a lot has happened since the time period where we left Peter off a couple of weeks ago. If you recall, last time we talked about Peter, we talked about this incredible mountaintop experience that Peter had with Jesus. And it happened to also include two of the biggest and most influential names in all of Scripture. Because it wasn't just Peter and Jesus, and James and John were there too, but they're not important to this particular part of the story. It was also Moses and Elijah. And that's an unusual moment because those guys have been, dead for a long time. So the fact that they make their way to this mountaintop experience with Peter and Jesus, that's unusual. We spent some time talking about how weird that must have been, but how awesome it must have been as well. And if that wasn't enough, as they're having this mountaintop experience, they get the cloud enveloping them, and then Peter gets to hear the voice of God himself saying, "This is my son, you should probably listen to him." And that's just a cool moment. And we talked about how Peter probably just wanted to stay on that mountain for as long as humanly possible, but he had to get back down. And you got to think that Peter's entire viewpoint of Jesus changes in this particular moment, right? I mean, can you imagine what it's like when they come down off the mountain and kind of get back to a regular life? Because, as soon as they get back down off the mountain, Jesus rips a demon out of a person's body in the same way that you and I might pull a weed out of our garden. Peter had seen Jesus do this sort of thing before, but you got to think after this experience, it's a little different. He saw Jesus after this moment heal more people and teach more lessons and do all this amazing stuff, but you got to think it's a little bit different than what it was beforehand. How could Peter's viewpoint of Jesus not change after that mountaintop experience? I would imagine in this particular moment that Peter's probably a little more in awe of the miracles that Jesus does, because now he understands exactly how he's able to do those. He's probably even more willing to pay attention to what Jesus has to say because he knows with what authority that Jesus is speaking to him. He's probably a little more dumbfounded by people who don't seem to be responding to Jesus. How could they not respond to him? For crying out loud, he is the Son of God. Peter got to see Jesus do amazing things beyond that, and Peter's probably wondering exactly when it is that Jesus is going to proclaim what his identity is and take the throne that is rightfully his. For all of Peter's life, he's been taught that Messiah was going to come and he was going to rescue the nation of Israel and he was going to lead them in revolt against Rome and that they were going to ascend to the power of the world like they used to be in the days of King David and King Solomon. So he's waiting for when is Jesus going to finally do this. He got a glimpse of the idea that more people were probably a little more ready for Jesus to do this just earlier this past week. As they were making their way to Jerusalem in order to celebrate the Passover, because frankly, what better city is there to celebrate the Passover in? Peter got a glimpse of people just as excited about Jesus as he is. See, as they were making their way into town, Jesus told a couple of disciples, hey, go ahead, you're going to find a donkey tied up there, just, go take that donkey. If the owners come out, tell them it's cool. Jesus said we could. And they do. That's a little unusual for Jesus. He doesn't normally ride on animals, but Peter thought, well, maybe he's just tired. We have to walk everywhere we go. He's got to be just worn out. But as Jesus enters in Jerusalem while riding on top of this donkey, he sees thousands of people celebrating that Jesus has come to town. They've laid their cloaks out on the street. They've cut off palms. They're waving them. And they're shouting, Hosanna! Blessed is he who comes in the name of the Lord. Praise to the Son of David. Peter probably can't help but smile to himself. Because these thousands of people, they're starting to believe what Peter already knows. Peter had firsthand experience to know that Jesus is the Messiah. And he's got to think, man, if they only knew that this is for real. Peter got to see a different side of Jesus during the course of this week too. Because no sooner than they make it to Jerusalem than Jesus wants to head to the temple. It kind of makes sense. A teacher, rabbi would want to go to the temple of God to celebrate once they make it into town. But when Jesus gets there, he sees something that everybody kind of knew was going on and knew it was a little on the shady side, but had been willing to tolerate. But Jesus wasn't. So Peter couldn't help but maybe chuckle to himself a little bit as he sees his friend, his mentor, and his teacher flipping over tables and running off merchants out of the temple of God. He can't help but laugh as these evil and malicious men who've been manipulating people for years at this point in time are running away in fear and in terror of Jesus. He just can't help but think this is such a cool moment for him. He knows it's probably not winning Jesus over with any friends of the priests or teachers that are in the temple, because there's a rumor that's been floating around for years that some of them are receiving kickbacks, and that's why they allow this kind of shady business to take place. But Peter can't help but just love the fact that Jesus has come to make this wrong right. But Peter's noticed something else the last few weeks since that mountaintop experience. As he's been listening to Jesus talk and listening to Jesus teach, probably a little closer attention than what he had been before, he notices, man, Jesus is talking a lot about his death. I mean, Jesus had mentioned it a couple of times before the mountaintop experience, but for whatever reason, it seems like the frequency of Jesus talking about his death and what's going to happen and how we're supposed to react and how it's all going to go down, it's picked up. It's almost like Jesus knows it's coming soon. Like he's able to just predict that this is happening and it's going to happen soon. But how could that happen? How could the Son of God die? I mean, this is God we're talking about. You can't kill God, right? So Peter's kind of put it off in his mind, but still there's something about it that's just resonating within him. Peter does his best to put all that out of his mind as he goes on with the rest of the week and listens to more of Jesus' teachings and sees more of Jesus' healings as they prepare for the Passover. And the rest of the disciples seem to be looking forward to celebrating the Passover as well. They're all excited. It's the holiday season. They can't wait for it. They're so excited about it. Jesus himself actually seems to be a little bit more amped up for this particular Passover than the ones beforehand. I mean, they'd celebrated a couple of Passovers with Jesus already, but now Jesus seems to be a little bit more amped for this particular Passover. Like this Passover is going to be really important. And so all of them are kind of in the spirit of this holiday together. They've celebrated together, but there's something different. Like this one might wind up to be one of the most significant Passovers we get to celebrate together. And now, today is the day. Today's the day we're going to celebrate this feast together. And the disciples and Jesus, they make their way into the room that they had kind of prepared for this particular holiday. The place where they'd designated was going to be where we were going to have our feast. And as soon as they get in the room, something's a little off. Something's missing. Let me explain. Typically in this time period, when you would come someplace to come and eat, whether it be a person's house or somebody's place of business or something like that, there would be somebody there who was there to wash your feet. You might be wondering, why would they need to wash their feet? Well, I'll be happy to tell you. It wasn't like today where you could just drive a car everywhere, that you have comfortable shoes with socks on them. And if you had a donkey or had a camel or some other animal that you could ride, it was only because you were financially well off. And this is Israel in the time of Rome, where they're getting taxed constantly. So nobody really had the kind of money that it needed to justify the ownership of an animal for riding purposes. So you walked everywhere you went. And their shoes weren't exactly our shoes. They basically wore very thin leather that were open-toed, that would tie up and that sort of thing. They didn't have, enclosures. They didn't have memory foam for comfort and support, which makes your shoes awesome. I've got them in my shoes right now. I'm very comfortable up here. But you're walking everywhere you go in open-toed shoes, and the roads aren't paved, they're dirt. So when you're walking, you're kicking up dust everywhere you go. And that's on a dry day. If it's rained or if it's the wet season, it's probably going to be pretty muddy. And there are occasionally some animals that make their way across the road, and if you're not watching your step while you're walking, everybody can see where I'm going with that, right? Like I don't have to go any further. Okay. Grandma had a cattle farm down in Kentucky. It's gross. So washing your feet is kind of a necessity in this point in time period. It's kind of one of those things that's expected as you come to dinner, that somebody's going to wash your feet, because it's not like you're going to sit down in a chair. It's, for some reason, I've never understood this. They actually would lay down to have their meals. I don't know about you. I can't think of that as a comfortable position to sit and eat, but maybe for tacos because you're already at that incline, so. But anything else, it's just a little unusual, right? But they would lay head to somebody else's feet. So you can kind of imagine that washing your feet is pretty important. Like these days, it's always wash your hands before your meal. In this time period, it was, hey bro, I got to sit next to you. Could you please wash those feet? But when the disciples get into this room, there's nobody there. This wasn't like the job that everybody loved to have either. It wasn't exactly everybody's favorite chore to have in this particular household. In fact, it was usually, if the household had servants living in the household, it was reserved for the lowest guy on the totem pole. The servant of the servant of the servant. If it was your first day in the house and you're a new servant there, guess what, buddy? You're on foot duty. Nobody wanted that job. It's disgusting, right? I mean, even now with the shoes and the socks and the things that we have, it's still, I love all of you. I don't want to wash any of y'all's feet. It's weird and a little gross. It's nobody's favorite thing to do. It's disgusting, it's degrading, it's humiliating even. To clean the feet of other people. It's the worst job you could possibly imagine. And so while the disciples are around the table and they're trying to figure out who's going to take care of this, you can imagine their surprise with what happens next. Because there they are, they're waiting for somebody to wash their feet when John chapter 13 verses 4 and 5 happen. It says, so he being Jesus, got up from supper, laid aside his outer clothing, took a towel, tied it around himself. Next, he poured water into a basin and began to wash his disciples' feet and dry them with the towel tied around him. Now, for just a moment, I want you to try to put yourself in the disciples', I was going to say disciples' shoes, but they'd have their shoes off by this point. So, position, let's go with that. That's a better word. They've been around Jesus for a few years now. And they've gotten really close with him. They're pretty tight with him. The group's got some inside jokes and that sort of thing that involve Jesus. But at no point have they ever forgotten the hierarchy here. At no point have any of the disciples ever forgotten their particular position when it comes to Jesus. Jesus is their teacher. He's their master. He's the one that they're trying to model their lives after. If anything, he should be the most respected man in whatever room he's in with them. Because they are constantly looking up to him. They are constantly in awe of him. Because that's exactly the position that he commands. And now, he's doing the worst, most humiliating, most humbling, most degrading job that any one of them can think of. Let's go a little deeper here. Try to imagine what is going through Peter's mind. All right, because Peter's in on some information that at least 9 of the other disciples are not completely in on. Peter was there. He's seen Jesus do some incredible things. He was one of the first ones that Jesus brought in. He's seen more than the other disciples combined. He's seen almost every healing. He's been there for almost every teaching. He's seen Jesus raise the dead. He has seen Jesus do some incredible things. He can clearly picture Jesus still standing on the water, pulling Peter up as he was starting to slip himself. He can't shake the image of Jesus on that mountain, of how different he looked, of seeing Moses and Elijah standing there. That voice of God is still ringing in his ears. And now he's seeing the person he knows is the Son of God washing the dirty and disgusting feet of all his friends. It has to be completely jarring. It has to be upsetting. It has to be borderline horrifying for Peter to watch as Jesus does this, because Peter is watching his master, the Messiah, do the single most important or degrading act of service that Peter could ever think of. He can't understand why Jesus would do this. And so, as he's washing the feet of the disciples, Peter makes the realization, he's almost to me. And I think we can kind of understand why Peter reacts in the way that he does. I think we can kind of imagine why Peter would say some of the things that he says here. The thing that he says at the end of verse 6, he says, "Lord, are you going to wash my feet?" He's washed as Jesus has washed the feet of the others, including Judas, who is Peter's friend, but he's a little on the shady side. And yet Jesus has washed his feet already as well. And Peter doesn't feel like Jesus should wash his feet. He can't fathom what's happening here, let alone that Jesus would wash his own feet. So Jesus looks up at Peter, and their eyes meet, and Peter immediately is flashed back to that mountaintop, and he's seeing Jesus transformed once again. He's seeing what that face, he's reminded of how different Jesus looked on top of that mountain. And Jesus calmly tells him, "What I'm doing, you don't realize now, but afterwards, you'll understand." Peter's still not comfortable with this whole idea. He's not comfortable with this notion. I mean, how could you be in this particular scenario? It's uncomfortable enough, like we said, having somebody you know serve you, but let alone to have your teacher, your master, be the one who serves you in such a degrading fashion. And so Peter actually protests. Peter actually has the gall to stand up to Jesus and say, "You will never wash my feet." He doesn't say this in a way that's belligerent. He says it rather in a way of, "You of all people don't have to do this. And in fact, I should probably be washing your feet." But Jesus again looks at Peter. He looks at Peter with all the love that he can muster. And he tells Peter, "If I don't wash you, you have no part with me." And this particular sentence kind of causes Peter to shift gears, and he does what Peter so often does, and he puts his foot in his mouth, not literally because it hasn't been washed just yet. But he says something that's pretty typical Peter. He goes completely 180, the whole opposite direction. Peter, in an attempt to kind of prove his total devotion to Jesus, actually goes completely the other way and says, "Lord, not only my feet, but my hands and my head." Just a second ago, it's like, "Hey, don't touch my feet. They're disgusting. I don't want you washing those." And now he's like, "Hey, could you bathe me? That'd be cool." It's a weird shift, isn't it? "Don't wash my feet." Okay, wash my feet, but wash the whole of me too. Unusual shift. He's basically telling Jesus, "I want to prove my utter devotion and commitment to you, and how committed I am in following you, and how much I believe in who you are. And so if you want to wash my feet, then go ahead and wash me entirely." And Jesus more or less tells him that's not really necessary. Washing his feet is going to be enough. And so he washes Peter's feet. And as Jesus finishes up, after he's done washing the feet of all the disciples, as he cleans up the basin and puts it away where it goes and unties the towel from around him and puts his outer cloak back on and rejoins them at the table, you can kind of picture that for each one of the disciples, it's dead silent. Nobody is saying a word. But man, all eyes are on Jesus. They are completely and utterly shocked that their master would serve them in this fashion. And so as Jesus rejoins them at the table, he looks around the room and makes eye contact with each and every one of them. You can kind of imagine he softly clears his throat to tell them why this happened, to tell them why he would do such a degrading and humiliating and humbling thing. We can read about it. He says to them, "You call me teacher and Lord, and you are speaking rightly, since that is what I am. So if I, your Lord and teacher, have washed your feet, you also ought to wash one another's feet. For I have given you an example that you should do just as I have done for you." In this setting, we talk over and over and over again about the ways that Jesus, the Son of God, came to earth, put on flesh, and instead of demanding to be served everywhere he went, instead spent all of his time serving others. And we marvel at the miracles that he performed and the ways that he healed the sick, the people who weren't supposed to live normal lives had an opportunity to live normal lives just simply because they had an interaction with Jesus. But this moment is more. In this particular moment, in this particular story, we're shown just the depths that Jesus, the Son of God, was willing to go to serve. And in this narrative, Jesus tells us exactly what it means to follow him. If we're going to claim Jesus in our lives, if we are going to claim to be followers and disciples of Jesus, if we're going to take the name Christian, then we need to be willing to serve in whatever form or fashion that takes. To reach out and serve the people around us. To look at the person sitting next to us today and be willing to serve them in whatever way they need. To not bicker about how do we serve that need or how can we raise the money to serve that need, but to see the need and actually meet it. To serve in whatever capacity that means. We cannot, hear me, we cannot claim to follow Jesus if we are unwilling to serve. That is a heavy, heavy statement to make. We cannot turn our nose up at the notion of serving the people around us. We can't make excuses as to why we're not willing to serve. If Jesus is willing to go to this level, to do the worst job that any one of the disciples could ever imagine, and simply do it out of love, and because he recognized it needed to be done, how much more willing should we be? How much more willing should his followers be willing to serve? But far too often we tend to look like the disciples in this scenario. We tend to look more like the disciples at the beginning of this story, looking around the room for who is going to be willing to serve, who is going to be the one doing this job, who is going to be the one to meet this need. Because that's what each and every one of them were doing. They were waiting to be served. I didn't see Peter or James or John or Andrew or any of the others try to take the towel out of Jesus' hand. And so if the Son of God is willing to do this, to humble himself, we need to be willing to do the same. To humble ourselves to serve the people that are around us. But we tend to scoff at the idea of serving other people. We make excuses. We come up with all sorts of different reasons as to why we can't do that. But the truth is, and if you hear nothing else this morning, this is the most important thing you need to hear. We are most like Jesus when we are willing to tie the towel around our own waist and wash the feet of the people around us. I genuinely believe that if we want to become more like Jesus, which, correct me if I'm wrong, is the whole point of what being a Christian is supposed to be, but if we want to be more like Jesus, we do it when we serve the people that are around us. If we're not willing to serve the people around us in the same spirit of love that Jesus served his disciples, then what's the point? What are we even doing here? Church, we need to be willing to serve. We need to make Love Kokomo a little bit more than just a cute slogan. We need to make Love Kokomo a little bit more than just a great t-shirt concept. We need to actually be willing to tie the towel around our own waist and go and love Kokomo through service. I mean, Jesus said it himself. For I have given you an example that you should also do just as I have done for you.